Hi there, and welcome to my video on basic and beginner tips for watercolor painting with me, MB. So let's get started. It's best to use two jars for water, one that you dip your clean brush in and one that you use to clean your brush. When you're getting started with watercolor, I really recommend just buying a brush that's suggested for watercolor. I tend to use a medium-sized brush that's fluffy and sort of rounded but pointed at the end. You can use all different sizes, bigger brushes for washes and finer brushes for detail. Try to always start with a wet brush. Part of watercolor is being able to dry your brush when you need it. A lot of people use paper towel. I often tend to use rags. I try to use things that are a white color so that I can see how dirty or clean my brush is. It's also really important to have a palette for mixing. You can use a proper palette, or just a plastic container or lid will do just fine. Watercolor papers come in a variety of price points. I tend to use cold press paper, which is sort of a medium roughness, but you can also get smoother or hot press paper and a rough texture. You can get 100% cotton paper, which is recommended for artists and professional work, but any paper will do when you're getting started, as long as it's recommended for watercolor use. There are heaps of different types of watercolors. I'm going to be using 3 different kinds. The first are pan watercolors, both this handmade set and this Cotman set from Winsor Newton. This set's quite good as it also has a mixing palette. I'm also going to be using tube watercolors from Winsor Newton under the Cotman range, as well as watercolor pencils. Watercolor pencils generally have watercolor effects marked on the barrel so that you can tell that they're activated by water. Whatever your supplies are, you can create really beautiful art with them. I suggest swatching out your materials, both in the colours that you have and in the colours that you can mix by combining different shades. It's amazing how many different shades you can make from just a few colours. And it's really handy to have swatching palettes on hand when you're making artwork so you know what things look like when you paint with them. It makes choosing colours for artwork really easy. I'm now going to go over a few of my own tips for how you can work with these different watercolours. Another really useful thing is a spritzing gun. I generally wet pan watercolours before I use them to help them get a bit soaky and more pigmented. And then to draw colour, I wet my brush and then grab some pigment from the colour I'm using. You don't have to put it straight onto the paper, but for this example I'm going to. It's really fun to mix your own colours, and you can use that by adding that pan colour into your palette. You can add water to lighten it if you want and make more of a wash, and grab more pigment if you want it to become darker. You can also vary the texture by whether you use wet paint on dry paper or wet paint on wet paper that you've wet either with water from your brush or with a spritzing bottle. You can grab another shade and either blend directly on the paper. You can drop colour in and see how it interacts like I'm doing here. And then you can also mix pigments in your mixing palette to create new shades. When you're using tube watercolours, you don't apply them straight to the paper, you use a palette to put dots on. One cool thing is that if these dry, like these have on my palette, you can still use water to reactivate them. It means you don't waste a lot of paint. And again with these, you can mix them really well. You can mix them either on the palette, or if you've got wet watercolour still on your paper, you can blend it in. If you've got dry watercolour on your paper, you can layer colours over using any different kind of watercolour, as long as the previous colour has dried. It's amazing how many colours you can make by mixing colours. Using just yellow, red and blue, I was able to make all of these colours on the wheel. And the last watercolour technique I'll be talking about is using watercolor pencils. You can apply these onto both wet and dry paper. Try to apply them from the side so you're not denting the paper, and then you can add water and activate them straight on the paper. Once you've drawn pigment up off the paper, you can mix it like normal in your mixing palette. You can also scribble with your pencil directly on the palette to create a colour palette there, Or create a palette on some additional paper, scribbling down a big bit of colour and then using water to activate it and draw pigment from. When it comes to swatching, use a waterproof black pen and make sure you write down which shades you're using. I then like to draw circles and then some rectangles. It's also a good idea to lay down some small black characters that you can use to test the opacity of your watercolour. Wash it out, start with a wet brush and apply some plain water to the circles you've drawn. Once you've done that, we're going to grab some pigment, in this case blue pan pigment, and drop it straight in to see how it blooms and how it reacts with the water when you apply wet on wet. Following that, apply a hue or shade of blue and your darkest, most vibrant shade you can at the top, gradually adding water and cleaning off your brush as you go down to try to show from darkest to lightest. Do the same with red, yellow, and black if you're using it. I've just done these with these 4 colours here, but I really suggest doing this with every watercolour that you own in each different colour. It really helps to create a guide map for how your watercolours look when they're at different shades, but also as to how they react with water. A lot of artists don't tend to use black shades, but create black shades that look more natural using a mix of colours. That said, when you're starting out, or when you're established, there's nothing wrong with using black. It can be really helpful for line work, as well as for shadows. I definitely still use black, but I've also perfected a little bit of a recipe for a natural black that I can mix myself. To create a natural homemade DIY black, I usually start by using a warm-toned blue, a warm-toned red, and a green made using my warm blue, and in this case a warm yellow. When you mix them all together, they make a really nice black shade that looks really earthy and natural. I've compared it here with a tube black so you can see the difference. There's not a lot of difference, but the DIY black has a really nice natural shade that works really well for shadows. Once your swatch is dry, it's a really nice reference chart for the different variations in colour you can get. As I said before, it's a great idea to swatch out all of your colours and keep them handy. They're a really nice reference guide, and you can actually arrange all of the colours that you have into your own colour wheel as well. As you can see here, I've got little black hearts that I've tested the opacity of my watercolours. I found that lighter watercolours or chalkier watercolours usually tend to be less transparent. You want transparent colours because they're easier to layer, but there's nothing wrong with a bit of opacity. I painted this penguin using 4 different colours from watercolour tubes, in a warm blue, a warm red, a warm yellow, and a tube black. Here's how I mixed them to create some base shades. For the first one, I used a yellow and a red wash with quite a lot of water added to make it almost peachy skin tone. That's what I used for the stomach or white areas of the penguin to add some definition and shade. The next colours I mixed were the blue with a tiny touch of the black. This made a bit of a muddy blue, which is what I wanted. When I first applied it, it was a little bit bright, so I added a little bit more black. While the water's still wet on the page, you have got a lot of flexibility around the different shades you create and how you can mix in water or pigment to adjust the colour. I used this bluish black shade for the wings and the dark areas on the penguin. I then mixed a red shade using another combination of the red and the yellow with less water and slightly more red to create this bright reddish orangish colour which is what I used to lay down the base for the beak and the feet. For the black, I did use the pigmented black from the tube, but I also mixed in a little bit of blue to make it more natural. So this should give you an idea of how you can create a colour palette for something you want to do. As you can see, it's pretty simple, and I started off with really light washes. And you can kind of see how they all fit into the penguin. Watercolour is a really wonderful medium, and I'm definitely not an expert. But I hope that this has encouraged your creativity to try it out at home, try see what you can do with your supplies, and paint some really cool stuff. For the upcoming class, you will need a yellow, a red, a blue, and a black. And that's it. If you've liked this video, please let me know. Subscribe, find me on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, and enjoy making art.